Have you ever watched a movie or a TV show where police officers or detectives have used the help of a psychic or a medium to help them solve their cases or help them solve mysteries? Well, that's actually happened in real life. There have been actual cases of mediums or psychics helping detectives and police officers solve crimes or even help find bodies of murder victims or have been a part of the cases. Of course, some of them are fake and some of them people are using to make money and to get their name out there. But there are some people who were actually a part of investigations, or even a psychic that we're going to talk about that was the very first psychic medium to ever take the stand and be part of trial. So I wrote down 3 psychics that were a part of a murder mystery or part of a crime that actually kind of helped. So I'm going to share them with you today. But before we get started, my name is Kat. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you've never been on my channel. I appreciate you joining me on this channel. I talk about random things, but mostly things that interest me. Lately it's been spooky things. I've talked about ghost ships, talked about ghost stories told by nurses. I've talked about my own ghost stories, and today we're going to talk about psychics that actually played a part in solving crimes and mysteries. So if that's something that you're interested in, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification, and let's get started with this video. But before we get started, my name is Kat. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you've never been on my channel. I appreciate you joining me on this channel. I talk about random things, but mostly things that interest me. Lately it's been spooky things. I've talked about ghost ships, talked about ghost stories told by nurses. I've talked about my own ghost stories, and today we're going to talk about psychics that actually played a part in solving crimes and mysteries. So if that's something that you're interested in, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification, and let's get started with this video. The very first person we're going to talk about is a victim named Ashley Howley and the psychic named Christy Robinette. So Christy Robinette is a psychic medium who claims to be able to speak to spirits and the dead and even angels. And in this case that happened in 2004, she said that she was shaken awake by a ghost of a blonde woman who was 20 years old, telling her that she was just murdered. And of course that would scare you awake if all of a sudden you were being shaken awake by a spirit. So Christy said that this actually happened often, where ghosts that were disgruntled or weren't able to find peace and pass on would contact her, kind of like the show Ghost Whisperer, kind of, I guess. But she came to her and told her that she was murdered, and was, according to Christy Robinette, was giving her clues as to who murdered her, where her body was, and like what she was wearing and stuff like that. So Christy, she got out of bed and decided to start searching up missing women on the internet, and when she stumbled upon Ashley Howley's missing persons report, she knew that that was the person, the ghost, the spirit that shook her awake. So she called the police and told the police the clues that Ashley had given her about what she was wearing and the person that murdered her. The police ended up putting Christy Robinette in contact with Ashley Howley's family, and so the family was working with the police and with Christy, and they were kind of doing their own investigations with and without the cops. Christy would present pictures to the family of light-colored pine trees and would say that that is where Ashley said that her body was. So eventually the family, a member of Ashley's family and Christy Howley, decided to go to Columbus, where Howley was living and was murdered, to kind of do their own investigation. And they met up with a park ranger who said that there was no light-colored pine trees where they were currently, but they knew where there was light-colored pine trees, that like where some were located, and so the park ranger took them there. The second that they got there, Christy knew that that's where Ashley was. She felt it. She knew that. She just felt it in her bones, and she felt it inside of her. But because the property was owned by someone, it was private property, the police couldn't dig or look too much further because it was private property. 2 years later, Ashley Howley's abusive and aggressive ex-boyfriend, McMichael, was arrested for the murder of his mom and her boyfriend. But a lot of his friends and acquaintances believed that he also murdered Howley. They would look in the marshy area of where it was suspected that her body could be, and just knew that that is where her body was. While he was incarcerated, and a lot of people don't know if this is real or not, because his attorney said that he didn't know if the prosecutors were speaking to him and he got this information from McMichael, but it is said that McMichael revealed to them that he did indeed murder her, and he said where her body was, which was by those light colored pine trees that Christy Robinette said that she was. The area that they had went to, that the park ranger took them to, was where Ashley Howley's body was found. And like I said, his acquaintances knew like that he killed her. They believed that he did, and they would look in that area behind the house and would say that's where she is. But a lot of the reason why they believed that he killed her was because the area that they found her body was close to where his father lived, which is where he lived occasionally. So, you know, kind of 2 and 2 getting put together. And a couple of days before Ashley Howley went missing, she had actually called the police because her ex, McMichael, had been abusing her and assaulted her. And so she called to report that abuse, and then she disappeared. This one I find really interesting. It didn't help solve her murder, but Christy Robinette did indeed find the place that she was because she was having these visions, and because she claimed that Ashley had come to her in her spiritual form, had shaken her awake and told her all these clues. Because all these clues that there's no way Christy would have known led her to the place that Ashley's body was, that they couldn't previously dig because it was private property. But because they had probable cause, they were able to do that afterwards. And I find that really, really interesting, because I do believe that some people are more sensitive than others, and I do think spirits will connect and contact people who they basically vibe with, or they can connect with, or find a personal connection with more than others. I do think that's why sometimes people don't have the same kinds of experiences that someone else has, where like I can go to a place where I'll have multiple experiences, but then someone else won't have one. And I think it's because sometimes your energy and your vibration might not match theirs. And I think with this one, I don't know if it was because I don't know if Ashley actually did I don't know if Ashley did contact her, or Christy just found her on the internet and just did her own investigations. It's one of those things that you don't know. Next story we're going to talk about is of John DeMars and Dorothy Allison. Dorothy Allison was a pretty well-known psychic medium who she actually helped in a lot of cases and was a self-proclaimed psychic criminal investigator. John DeMars was a Nutley, New Jersey resident. He had 2 sons and a wife. He was a really stand-up guy. He worked as an assistant loan officer at the Canal Street Chemical Bank of New York City. He graduated from Rutgers University. He was a first lieutenant in the Vietnam War and was described as a really great, really nice, responsible, well put together man. On the morning of December 20th of 1974, John called his wife Elaine to let him know that he was going to leave work early to meet up with some friends for dinner or for lunch. Can't remember which one, but he was going to leave work early to go spend time with some friends. He went to lunch with them, spent some time, talked about life and work and the fact that he was going to go bowling that night. At around 4:45 p.m., he had left work with one of his co-workers, saying that he was going to go spend some time with his kids. He and this co-worker left at the same time, and then John and the co-worker split ways, and John went to the Port Authority terminal at the World Trade Center to catch the train that he took to get home. Typically, John was very diligent about calling his wife Elaine. Even if he was gonna be 5 minutes late, he would call her to let her know that he was going to be late so that she was aware of anything that could happen. But this time in particular, he didn't. And when his train arrived to his destination, he wasn't on it. Now, Elaine became really concerned when he didn't come home, typically when he said he would, so she ended up calling the police to let them know that he wasn't home. And the police checked their normal places, hospitals, they checked for arrest reports and morgues, but nothing came up. A cab driver actually called the police a few days later saying that he believes he drove someone of John's description to the nearby airport, but there was a couple of things that were off, including what the man was wearing. So after learning what the man was wearing, the cab driver kind of figured that maybe he was wrong. Detective, I'm gonna say this wrong, Lubertazzi and others theorized that John maybe took money from the bank and then ran. But a lot of people didn't believe that because they said he was an upstanding, responsible guy and there was no money missing from the bank. The next theory was that he ran away with another woman, but again, a lot of the people that knew John said that he was the most devout father and wife, that he would never ever do that to Elaine and his boys. He had a perfect work record, was never late, never called out, he had no debt, and his credit cards hadn't been used. So his wife thought maybe John witnessed something on the train that he shouldn't have, and maybe that's why he went missing. Others believed that maybe he got amnesia and he could be out there somewhere, you know, not knowing who he is due to PTSD from being in Vietnam. There's a lot of theories as to why he went missing. Eventually, Elaine decided to try other avenues. She decided to contact the psychic, Dorothy Allison. Labrunsky went to see her, and he said that they were looking for a man that was missing, and the first thing that Dorothy Allison said to him was that he drowned and that he was dead. She said he had fallen off the train into the river and drowned. Lubertazzi, he was skeptical because he couldn't understand how that could possibly happen, how he could fall off the train and drown. Like, how could that possibly happen? He asked her if he had anything else, and she said that she saw, and I'm going to read this off, that she saw a burnt out building, 2 men, an ice pond and a row of tires, a little park where children would ride sleds down the hill, and she said that John smelled like fish and saw a bow and arrow. Now, of course, Lubertazzi was skeptical. He didn't understand how all these things even made even kind of sense, and anything had to do with John DeMars. But he still tried to search based on all of the things that Dorothy Allison said, but nothing came up. Until 2 months later, after John disappeared, a father and a son went target shooting with a bow and arrow and off a bluff that overlooked the, I'm going to say this wrong, Passaic River. And one of them shot an arrow and it missed and it went flying, and they went to retrieve it and they saw John's body floating face down in the water. This was really interesting because he had all of his personal belongings. He had his wallet in his pocket, his watch was still on, he was still fully clothed, nothing was missing. But the creepy part was what Dorothy said when she first spoke to Lubertazzi, that there was a burnt out building, that there were 2 men, bows and arrows. She did mention a series of numbers, 222 and 166. She also mentioned a snowy hill that children sled down and rows of tires. Well, after they found the body, they noticed some things that added up. Dorothy said the number 222, and John was found February 22nd. 222. The archery range was a 2 Guys discount store, and there was a father and a son doing target practice, bow and arrow. On the other side of the river was a burnt out factory building that was abandoned, so that fits with the burnt out part that she was seeing. And a nearby park had rows of tires lined on the sides to make a sled range so that people could go down the sled, go down the hill in this park safely on sleds. And a nearby barge had the numbers 166, which was another series of numbers that Dorothy said to Lubertazzi when he first met her. So everything that she said about John was true. He drowned. He was found February 22nd, which follows the series of 222 numbers that she saw. The bow and arrow and two men, which was the two men discount store and the father and the son doing target practice with a bow and arrow, the burnt out building, and the hill that kids would sled down with rows of tires. So a lot of people were kind of freaked out by that, and Lubertazzi more so than anybody else, because he was extremely skeptical, and now everything that she said was lining up. But another question was that, how did John drown? How is he on a train 1 minute and then face down in a river 2 months later? Well, the theory was that he fell asleep, and at 5:40 the train made an unscheduled stop on the Passaic River Railroad Bridge near Lyndhurst, New Jersey, and the doors opened to let out another passenger off the back of the train. There is a space between, there's probably a 2 foot or a decent space between the train and the edge of the bridge. So the theory is that John thought that it was his stop. He's half asleep. He thought it was his stop, and half asleep, he walked out the door, stepped off into that small space between the bridge and the train, and fell, and then drowned in the river. Now, the reason this could be feasible is because there was no lights on the bridge that night, and a passenger that was riding the train that day said that he himself almost stepped off the train as well, but then last minute realized that there was nothing there, that there was nothing in front of him, and that he could have fallen off as well. He also said there was no warning that the doors were being opened. There was nothing that said, hey, by the way, we're opening this door for another passenger, which I still don't understand why they would do that, that there was no warning of that. So John just fell to his death because there was no warning, no regulation. But that is the theory. In May, John's death was ruled as an accidental drowning. Lubertazzi stated that it gave him the chills when he realized that everything that Dorothy Allison said was true. That everything lined up. And that he was a skeptic, that he didn't believe that kind of thing. But after he met Dorothy, he believed her 100%. Now, like I said, Dorothy Allison was a self-proclaimed psychic detective, and she worked in several cases. A lot of people didn't believe her, and a lot of people did. Some people didn't believe her because I guess allegedly there was a point where she was accused of offering money to someone, to detectives, for them to state that she was helpful in a case when she wasn't. But then there were other cases, like this one, that she was really helpful with. And a lot of people could say that she's a very smart woman and maybe she made a deduction. Maybe he fell off the train or a bridge and then drowned. But those very specific things, like the numbers, the 222, and he was found February 22nd, the 166 and the barge had those numbers on it, the two men and the bow and arrow, those are very specific. So, in my opinion, she did predict this, and she did help Detective Lubertazzi figure out this case. Not directly, but she did help kind of figure out what happened to John DeMar. And that kind of gives me chills a little bit. Next one we're going to talk about is kind of dark and kind of sad, and it's a long one. It is a murder case. And I did forego the really gruesome nitty-gritty parts that I don't think this had to share, but I did include some of the really important parts. So this is Andre, I'm going to say this wrong, so I apologize. I think it's Daigle, which was a disappearance that happened June 9th of 1987. So Andre was a resident in River Ridge, New Orleans. It was said that he was everybody's friend. He was super nice. He got along with everybody. He was hardworking, and just a really great guy. June 9th in 1987, Andre and his friend Nick went to a dinner at around 10, and then they left and went to a bar. They had drinks. They had good talks. There was a woman named Thelma that they met. They kind of got on with. Andre tried to kind of push her towards Nick, but she wasn't really interested in Nick. She was kind of more interested in Andre. Andre was about to leave. He left the bar, and Thelma needed a ride home. He offered her a ride home, and that night was the last night that Andre was ever seen alive. Andre's mom and brother were really, really concerned after they realized that they hadn't heard from Andre in like over a week, which was really, really not normal for them. They were a very close-knit family and really like stayed in contact. So when they realized they hadn't heard from him, they called the police, but they didn't get an investigation because Andre was an adult, and him being an adult and no signs of anything bad or foul play, they didn't launch an investigation. So his brother, Chris, knew that Andre wouldn't just disappear for no reason, so he decided to kind of start his own investigation and start to look into everything. And so Andre's family began their own investigation. They tried speaking to Nick, his friend, who he went to the bar with. They tried to speak about the woman. He and Nick told them about the woman that they met. They tried to speak to witnesses at the bar, but nothing really came of it. They drove around the greater area of New Orleans trying to see if they could find any signs of Andre, where he could have gone, his vehicle that he could have left behind, anything. Andre's sister, Elise, had spoken to a co-worker about Andre, and the co-worker suggested Rosemarie Kerr, a psychic medium. They suggested that maybe she should try to contact her because maybe she could potentially help find Andre and figure out where he could be and what happened to him. So Elise drove and met her, and she told Rosemary that her brother was missing, that Andre was missing. She presented a picture to Rosemary. Rosemary touched it and got this sense and this immediate feeling that Andre was dead. She also got a vision of Andre in a dark colored vehicle with a man that had long blonde hair. Andre had recently bought a truck, and Elise had no idea, so she kind of didn't believe this part because he was originally driving like a silver or white vehicle, but he didn't know cats. But she didn't know that he had recently bought a new darker like truck, like a vehicle. But Rosemary insisted that this was true, that he was in a dark vehicle. She put her finger on a map and blindly stopped on an area she felt like had the vibrations that she felt the energy from, and it was near Slidell, Louisiana, and St. Tammany Parish. Sorry. But she again sensed that he was dead, but she chose not to tell Elise because she didn't want to kind of... It would be really hard to tell someone, oh, I think he's dead, because you don't want them to lose hope in the fact that they could be alive. So she chose to forego with that. But she had a feeling that Elise kind of could tell and sense it. So Elise called her family about Rosemary, and desperate for something, Chris, his brother, and his wife Virginia drove towards Slidell, and as they drove, they found the truck, Andre's truck, on the side of the road. And Chris recognized it because Chris knew that Andre bought this vehicle. So he decided to follow the truck because he felt just really suspicious about it. And this truck was being really weird. The truck was driving for about 30 minutes, got off the highway, took off the highway to St. Tammany Parish until a little while, went down a dark, deserted road, and then stopped at the end of the road, parked, and turned off its headlights. Now, Chris and his wife got a little spooked out by this car because of that, because they didn't understand what they were doing. But after a while, the person driving the truck started up again and started driving again. And Chris, after he kind of got rid of the wigs, he began following them again. And conveniently, as they were passing, he passed a patrol car and passed a cop and decided to pull over and tell the cop that he needs to follow that truck. He needs to get to that truck. And so Officer Corley was like, all right, I hear ya. I'm going to stop this truck. And he went after this truck, and I guess they went on a high-speed chase for a little bit. But eventually Officer Corley did get them to stop and pull over. Driver, and I'm going to say his last name wrong. The driver was Charles Gervas, and the passenger seat was Michael Phillips, who was a man with long blonde hair. Hold on to that knowledge. While the other officer arrived and started watching, detained the two men, Officer Corley decided to search the vehicle and look outside the vehicle to see if he can find any evidence that this was indeed Andre's truck and could figure out if it was stolen. And oddly enough, there was 2 handguns on the front passenger side floorboard, and Charles had a felony charge, so he wasn't allowed to have firearms. So he was arrested for possession of a firearm and a stolen vehicle, and Michael was arrested for a stolen vehicle as well. Now this is where this gets interesting. Well, it's always interesting, but this is where it gets more interesting. Michael signed a right to waiver, which is basically you're signing your rights away. They can record you, you can say anything, then they can record you and do whatever they want because you're signing your rights away. You're signing your right away to an attorney and all that stuff. So, and Michael agreed to speak to the PD Sheriff Dan Rayner. He said the truck belonged to Charles's employer and it wasn't stolen. And of course, Charles refused to speak to Raymore until he had an attorney, because obviously. So Michael was sitting at Michael was sitting at Rayner's desk writing a written statement, and this was making Charles really squirrely and uncomfortable because he saw him doing this and he decided to change his mind about not speaking about everything and not wanting an attorney, and decided to sign a rights waiver of his own. And of course everybody was surprised. But the second Charles entered Sheriff Raynor's office, he said, "We did it, we killed him." But what Charles didn't know was that they weren't arresting them for murder. They were arresting them because they had a stolen vehicle. They were investigating the stolen vehicle. They weren't investigating a homicide. But Charles believed that Michael had already told them about murdering Andre and had already confessed, that he was worried that if he didn't confess, all of it would be put on him. So he decided, oh, I need to tell him. Immediately, Sheriff Raynor decided that he had to read them their Miranda rights because holy shit, and then started recording their conversation about this confession. Charles led the police to the apartment that they had killed Andre at. And he led them to where his body was. Andre's body had evidence of beatings and strangling, and his body was stuffed in a sofa. Charles had no remorse or guilt, according to the sheriff. He had nothing. No guilt, nothing. He felt nothing towards it. And he and Phillips were charged for first-degree murder. But where does this woman come into play, right? Because Andre and Nick, his friend, went to the bar and they met Thelma, a woman who left with Andre because she needed a ride, and then Andre was never seen again. Well, later to find out, Thelma was, I believe, either Michael's or Charles's girlfriend, and she was the accomplice, and they made a plan to kill Andre and to steal his truck so they could, I don't know. I believe the reasoning was they were running out of money, they were going to get evicted, and they needed money and a vehicle. And so they decided, we're just going to kill Andre. So now that Charles had already confessed And his motion, he made a motion, an appeal or whatever, to suppress the tapes that were recorded and his written statement, his written confession, but of course he was denied. And Charles was sentenced with life in prison. Now, as for Michael and Thelma, they both entered not guilty pleas. And so they had to go to trial. Investigators actually contacted Rosemary Kerr, the psychic, while preparing for the trial, and she provided details that nobody knew, that there's no way they could have known, that the public didn't know, and that she couldn't have known. She described his head injury, she described the specific area that his body was, she described Michael, she described the truck, she described everything. And District Attorney W.J. LeBlanc determined she was a compelling fact witness and wanted the evidence she provided to be shown to the jury. Rosemary was the very first person who was a psychic medium in U.S. history to take the stand and to testify. The very first, because what she saw in her visions were absolute evidence. Details that the public could have not known, that the police and detectives had never released. So she was a key witness to a murder, and they believed that the jury needed to know that. So Michael changed his plea to guilty, from not guilty to guilty to avoid the death penalty. And Thelma, this wonderful woman, she was also given a guilty verdict, and she was indicted for first-degree murder, but she was convicted of second-degree murder and was also sentenced to life in prison, just like Michael and Charles. Thank God. And again, like I said, I decided not to share the really dark and gruesome details, because if you want to look up this case, it's what they did to Andre is awful, and they killed him for some personal gain, but they mostly killed him for sport, just because they could. And that's really fucked up. And if you want to read that part, you can, but I decided not to share that part. So Andre's family, the Louisiana law enforcement, credited Rosemary Kerr, the psychic, with providing information, because without that information, without the information that she sold, or without the information that she shared, the case would have gone cold. So if Elise wouldn't have spoken to her co-worker about her brother, and if her co-worker didn't suggest her going to Rosemary Kerr, the case probably would have gone cold, and they would have never figured out, where his body was. What Rosemary told Elise, and then Elise shared with Chris, wouldn't have made him go to Slidell to see if he could find any evidence, and he wouldn't have seen the truck. None of it would have happened without Rosemary's influence. Rosemary kept in contact with Andre's family for a really long time, and she even said that she kept in contact with Andre himself for a while, until she passed and died at the age of 80 in 2015. This case is wild to me, because this was an actual case of a psychic giving key evidence to solve a case. Without her influence, without her sharing what she shared, it would have gone cold, and nobody would have found out what happened to Andre, and the family would have gotten no closure. They wouldn't have known anything. And for her to be the very first psychic to take the stand and testify in a U.S. history is wild. And I couldn't find any other psychics, because I'm sure there are others, but I couldn't find any others in the U.S. Rosemary Kerr is the very first one that always popped up, that she was the very first psychic medium to take the stand and testify. And I think that is the coolest thing. But without her vision, without her connecting with Andre, without that, they would have figured it out. He would have gone cold, and he probably would have been one of those cases that would have never been solved. So she was a key part. But so was Elise, and his brother Chris, and his mom, and his wife Virginia, and that co-worker that suggested Elise talk to Rosemary Kerr. All of these things lined up perfectly in order for this to work out. because if they didn't, it wouldn't have. Elise was meant to talk to her coworker. Her coworker was meant to tell her about Rosemary, and Elise was meant to go contact her. These things were meant to happen because he was meant to be found. And to me, it really is awful and fucked up that these three people targeted him for fun and probably some personal gain, but I think that's really fucked up, and people are awful sometimes. But I'm really happy that they did, even though it's awful what happened to Andre and that he died so young. I am glad that they were able to find out what happened to him, and I appreciate what Rosemary Kurd did for the family. Those are 3 cases where psychic mediums did play a part in solving mysteries and crime cases and murder cases. I honestly am quite skeptical when it comes to psychic mediums, simply because when I was researching this, there were more cases of people trying to swindle and take advantage of cases rather than people helping. And I know people will use people's grief and pain to their advantage. Now, like I said, I do think that there are people who are more connected to things than others. I am an empath. I'm a sensitive. I do think I am connected to certain things more than other people. But psychics and mediums, for me, I kind of have a hard time with. I have never met one in real life, though. I have never met one personally, a legit one personally, and so I am open to it, but I live in both worlds. I live in both worlds of skepticism and belief, and that's with really anything, ghosts, anything of the like. I just am, and so that's how I feel. But I did think that this was really interesting, that these psychics connected with these cases and the spirits of these cases and was able to help them solve the case, or were able to be key parts of the case. So I found that really interesting. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think and the way that you feel about it. Do you believe in psychics and mediums? Do you not believe? Like, what are your thoughts? I'd really like to know. Also, I'm sorry about the terrible lighting. It's late and my light that I used to light me up broke. So I need to go buy a new one, but I still wanted to make this video because I thought it was really interesting, and I hope you liked it too. So if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Like I said earlier, if you want to hit the subscribe button, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification so you can be notified whenever I post. And I hope that you have a wonderful day and a beautiful night. Please be safe out there, and this is Kat signing off.